So on his website, Roy Spencer helpfully put up the slides to a talk he gave about climate change. Now, in the past, Roy has been extremely interested in what I have to say about climate change, so I thought I would take this opportunity to critique Spencer's talk, and I'm sure he'll be extremely excited to hear what I think about it. So let's get right into this. So let's begin by talking about the techniques of denial that are executed in this talk. So the first one, it's right on this opening slide, is this idea of no climate crisis. Now, you hear this all the time from people trying to cast doubt on climate science. They'll say that it's not an emergency, it's not a catastrophe, it's not a crisis. And the important thing is science can never tell you something's a crisis. It can never tell you something's an emergency. There is no test or experiment you can do that concludes, yep, it's an emergency. This is a value judgment. But of course, he doesn't say that. He implies that this is some kind of scientific statement, which it absolutely is not. And so I'll point out throughout the talk that Spencer mixes in values with his science. You also see that there's wacky conspiracy theories. So right there, prophets of doom. Notice he spells prophets, Profits. I'm sure he thought he was being incredibly clever with this. But what it really is it's a conspiracy theory. And so, the people who tell you climate change is a crisis, they're obviously doing it for the money. And so just on this first slide, you can see some of the techniques he's going to be using to push climate denial. And then I'll also talk in the talk about inappropriate use of uncertainty and omission of important facts. So this is just a time waster. Okay, so I agree with this slide. Public perception of climate change is deeply divided, so I don't think I need to talk any more about that. Okay, so now we're getting to some interesting stuff. So the first thing is this idea of slow warming is occurring. So this is, again, not really a scientific statement because there's no context given for the statement. In fact, if you put that into a paper, I guarantee the reviewers would object to it. So what does he mean by slow? Slow compared to what? If you say it's slow, meaning the climate next year is going to be about the climate this year, yeah, that's probably right. But it's actually extremely fast in the sense that people born today are going to live through enormous amounts of climate change. In addition, if you're building infrastructure, say an airport or a highway or a subway system, climate change is fast enough that you have to take climate change into account when you build that infrastructure. So this is really, as a lot of this talk is, it's just meaningless because there's no context given for these adjectives. It's just vanilla denial. And of course, no climate crisis or emergency. This is a value judgment. This is not science. So what Spencer should say is, I don't think it's a crisis. I don't think it's an emergency. That would be correct because that implicitly implies that it's his values that are determining this. It's not science. Number two, I actually don't see any issues with number two. Okay, so I think I could agree with that. What is climate science fairly certain of? Okay, so I think there is some stuff on here that's not too bad. First, let's talk about, first of all, the climate system has warmed in recent decades. Yes, okay, I agree 100% with that. At least most question mark of this warming is due to increasing carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning. So this is almost right. What the IPCC says is it is extremely likely that most of the recent warming is due to human activities. And our best estimate is that it's 100% of the recent warming. So Roy almost said that. Through gritted teeth, he had most question marks. So it was almost right. So I'm going to give him credit for that. Warming should continue to the future. Yes, that is correct. But again, he just can't let it go. It's not a cause for alarm. That's his opinion. So that is not a scientific statement. That is a value judgment. Lots of people, myself included, when I use my values tell me that this is quite concerning. But obviously not everybody shares my values. Spencer clearly doesn't, so he doesn't think it's alarming. That's fine, and that's fine. The thing I object to and what's so irritating is that the pretense is made that this is science, that his statement that it's not cause for alarm is scientific, and it is not. Okay, so let's move on. What is uncertain? All right, so first off, we can agree that climate change can change without any forcing. So people in the scientific community often talk about unforced variability. So absolutely, climate change can change without forcing. But then he has above it a really interesting statement. Natural causes of climate change are largely not understood. So this is really a very cleverly constructed argument that has really very little behind it. So it's worth decomposing this. Okay, so it's important to understand that this is not a testable hypothesis. Rather, it's an expert judgment. So a testable hypothesis would be a claim like the Earth is warming or the Earth is not warming. You can download some data, you can run a statistical test on the data, and you can conclude it's warming or it's not warming. This statement, natural causes of climate change are largely not understood, is an expert judgment. It is, what it means is that Spencer has read the literature and he's concluded that we don't understand this. And scientists do this all the time. I do this all the time. Everybody's always reading the literature and they're always evaluating what we know and what we don't know, because that's one of the most important steps in science, is to figure out what a good question is by determining what are the things that we don't know. But what's interesting is this is written in the passive voice, and it's extremely vague. So he's not talking about what the time scale is. Does he mean over 4.5 billion years? Does he mean over 100 years? Does he mean over 50 years? And the passive voice part of it is that you don't know who is making the statement. Are the natural causes of climate change largely not understood by Spencer, or are they not understood by the scientific community? So it's extremely vague. And I think intentionally so, because this is really only Spencer's opinion. If you go to a meeting of climate scientists, they don't agree with that. I think that especially over the last century, or particularly over the last half century, the natural causes of climate change are understood, and they cannot explain the recent warming. In fact, so let me just go over quickly about why we're so sure that humans are driving the climate change. So first off, we have a theory. We understand how adding greenhouse gas will warm the surface. We're adding greenhouse gases to the surface, to the atmosphere. So based on just those two things, you should expect the climate to warm. And this is not new stuff. A lot of the physics here was worked out in the 19th century. And the first person to suggest that the climate was warming due to humans was in the 1930s. In addition, if you look at the paleoclimate record, you can see there's a strong correspondence between climate change and carbon dioxide. If you don't believe that, I recommend you Google Richard Alley control knob and watch his AGU talk on this. It's really great. In addition, climate models. Climate models cannot predict the warming of the 20th century without putting carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in. And finally, there's no legitimate alternative theory. We can list all the things we think have driven natural climate change in the past, and we can exclude all of them. There's no theory, there's no evidence for anything other than carbon dioxide. And because of this, we have the IPCC has concluded there's a 95% confidence that humans are responsible for most of the recent warming. Some people might say it's cosmic rays and clouds, or it's the orbit of Jupiter, or it's some other exotic theory for which no evidence exists, but it's very hard to rule out. And the 95% confidence here reflects the fact that there's a very small chance that it could be something we haven't thought about. My personal view is that I look at this 95% chance as the difference between reasonable doubt and absolute doubt. In other words, I can say that carbon dioxide is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but I wouldn't say it's guilty beyond an absolute doubt. And so, this is, me to say, an example of what I call fake uncertainty in this talk. And this is another method of denial. you make these extremely vague statements that make the impression that we don't understand things that we actually do. And so for the last few decades, we absolutely know that climate change is driven by humans, and that this is just completely wrong. And it's wrong in a way that's extremely cleverly put together. All right, global warming theory. It's all about energy balance. Yes, I think I agree with much of what's in here. Of course, there's a little fake uncertainty. Exactly how much warming will occur is uncertain and debatable. And so that's technically true. Okay, I don't know if it's going to be 3 degrees of warming or 5 degrees of warming. That depends on uncertainty in the physics. It also depends on uncertainty in the emissions pathway. But the impression you get, again, fake uncertainty, the impression you get is that is that the uncertainty is unbounded. Maybe we'll get 0 warming. Maybe we'll get 100 degrees of warming. Who knows? And that's wrong. There is uncertainty, but the uncertainty is bounded. And we know that it includes warming that could be extremely large. And I'll talk about that in a second. And I'll talk about what I mean by extremely large. I will not leave you hanging and not define my terms. Okay, so I don't think there's a lot to say here, other than, again, a little more fake uncertainty. Since 2005, only about 0.8 watts per square meter of energy imbalance. So that's correct. If you measure the top of atmosphere Earth energy imbalance, it's about 0.7 watts per square meter. Now, what humans have actually done is more like 2 watts per square meter. The reason it's less than that is the planet has actually warmed up in response and has wiped out about 2/3 of the energy imbalance. This is, again, fake uncertainty. It's right that it's order 1 watt per square meter. And so the implication here is that, well, that can't possibly be important. It's so small. But over a century, 1 watt per square meter can give you a significant amount of warming. And so this really doesn't mean anything. It really means nothing. It's true. It's kind of, the analogy is, it's the argument that, like, carbon dioxide is only in the atmosphere at 400 parts per million. That's a small number. It can't possibly be important. That's essentially the argument Spencer's making here. It's 1 watt per square meter out of 300 of sunlight. How can that be important? Well, the answer is it is important. And in fact, we predict that should give you quite a bit of warming, and indeed it will. And I'll talk about what quite a bit of warming is in a second. And then, of course, this is the exact same argument he made before. This is fake uncertainty. All right, to repeat, global energy imbalance responsible for deep ocean warming is so much smaller than our knowledge of actual energy flows. Recent warming could mostly be natural. So again, that's just the same argument. He's repeating the same argument over again. His evaluation is that this is true. No one else agrees with that. If you go to a meeting of climate scientists, none of them agree with that. And in fact, there's no evidence for that. There's nothing in the peer-reviewed literature which suggests that the warming could be natural. At least that's convinced anybody. I will say, to Spencer's credit, probably about 10 years ago, he did try to publish some work that suggested that clouds were causing climate change, but nobody was convinced by that. It's an idea that went nowhere. So the bottom, climate models that supposedly prove humans are responsible use circular reasoning. They assume from the outset that there is no natural source of warming. So this is one of the few things that's just total bullshit. It's absolutely wrong. The climate models do not assume there is no natural source of warming. The climate models include all of the physics that we think is going on. If he thinks there's some physical process which is not included in the models, it's important, then he's going to win a Nobel Prize. There is nothing. The models have everything in them that we think is going on. The fact that they do not simulate the warming of the 20th century without greenhouse gases is a piece of evidence in support of climate change. It is not evidence that the models don't include important physics. The models have everything we think is going on. So again, this is a bit more fake uncertainty, which the talk is full of. All right, so here's another thing which is total bullshit. NASA's best satellite instruments cannot measure global energy flows to the level of accuracy required to attribute warming to humans. In reality, we do not measure the energy imbalance of the planet with satellites. This is a paper, Improving Estimates of Earth's Energy Imbalance. What we measure them using something called the Argo array. These are floats in the ocean that measure the ocean temperature. That's how we figured out. We do not figure it out with satellites. So his statement is correct that the satellites can't do it, but it's incredibly, irresponsibly misleading because that's not how it's done. And so we know that the Earth's energy imbalance is 0.71 watts per square meter, plus or minus 0.1. So we can measure it with reasonably high precision. And in fact, on the very next slide, if you look over here, this is an Argo float. So they're talking about the heating of the ocean, and this is a picture of them throwing an Argo float that actually measures the Earth's energy imbalance by measuring the temperature change of the ocean. Here's actually a picture of it. And then, of course, you've got a little language of climate crisis, the alarmist language of climate crisis. So people that disagree with me are obviously corrupt, Spencer says. Okay, so now this is almost funny. So what you see here is that Spencer makes this argument about climate sensitivity. So just so everyone knows, climate sensitivity is how much warming you get if you double carbon dioxide and let the system run to equilibrium. And he cites a value from a recently published paper that gives a value of 1.5 to 1.7 degrees for climate sensitivity. And then he says models predict 3 to 3.5 degrees or more. And so up till now, he's been just like pushing fake uncertainty. We don't know this and we don't know this. It's just fake uncertainty layered upon fake uncertainty. And then when he gives this number, this is a legitimately uncertain number, and he completely ignores the uncertainty. If you look at the actual paper, they give a value of 1 to 3 degrees. The central value is 1.5 to 1.7 degrees. So that's the central value. But if you look at the error bars, it's 1 to 3 degrees. In addition, if you look at the IPCC models, the models predict climate sensitivity from 2 to 4.5 degrees. So you see that this estimate of the climate sensitivity actually overlaps substantially with the models. Now, it's not perfect overlap, but it's pretty good. And this is just wrong. Models produce 3 to 3.5 or more. Well, the mean is about 3.3 for CMIP5. And again, I don't know if Spencer reads the peer-reviewed literature anymore, but there are some real issues with these global energy budget analyses. And so I would suggest that these are almost certainly low biased. So there's actually probably pretty good correspondence between these. So this statement that the climate sensitivity of climate models is 2 times too high is just complete fabrication. And again, maybe Spencer doesn't read the literature and doesn't understand what an error bar is, and he didn't realize that there was uncertainty in the Lewis and Curry paper, and he doesn't really know the right values for the IPCC models. Or maybe he knows that and doesn't really care. I don't know the answer to that. The data fit both hypotheses. But, I mean, this is not a reliable assessment of the science in any way, shape, or form. So this is, we get similar results. Fair enough. I mean, and I don't have any doubt that all of the energy balance estimates get those low values. But again, the uncertainty in those values is extremely large and overlaps substantially with the models. All right, so now you get to this what I sort of consider this Potemkin village of denial. A lot of statements that are, potentially correct statements when given in an appropriate context. But it's really here where what he's not telling you is the important thing. So he says, for example, global wildfires, no change, storm intensity, and then at the bottom, some policy statements. Here's something about crop yields and deaths from climate catastrophe. I could go on and argue. Some of what he says is right. Some of what he says is right but misleading. Some of what he says is wrong. But I think it would be more useful to just say, what is he not telling you? Because that's really the important thing. All right, so let's look at projections of warming for the next century. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to convince you that the projected warming for this century is extremely large. And then we'll talk about the impacts of that in a second. So here's some model predictions. And again, there's uncertainty in model predictions, but there's no reason to think the models are running hot, so to speak. And recently, a recently published paper showed extremely good agreement between the predictions of the models and observations. So we should take these model estimates extremely seriously. And so on the x-axis is year, the y-axis is temperature increase relative to pre-industrial. This is in Celsius, but I've also marked Fahrenheit. And so you can see that depending on whether we have a worst case scenario or a medium scenario or a really good outcome, you can get sort of 2 to 5 degrees of warming over this century. That's 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. All right, so now Spencer, I'm sure if he was here, he'd say, well, that's a tiny amount of warming. How could 3 or 4 or 5 degrees possibly matter at all? And so I think it's worth explaining that this is the global average. The global average temperature is not what we experience. We experience local temperatures, and local temperatures can change a lot. But the global average does not change in large amounts, and seemingly small changes in the global average can correspond to large changes in what we experience. So as a good example, here's the last ice age. So 20,000 years ago, last glacial maximum, sea level was 300 feet lower because of all the water that was locked up on ice sheets. And it was a different planet. The climate was so different. If you ask yourself, how different was it? How much colder was it? You might be shocked to find out it was only 9 degrees Fahrenheit colder. Now, if I had told you we're going to cool the climate by 9 degrees, you probably would have said, oh, it's not a big deal. How big of a change can that possibly be? And the answer is, it gives you an ice sheet. So if we go back and we look at this, we are looking at warmings by the end of the 21st century that are comparable to the warmings since the last ice age. This is an enormous amount of warming. If we're at the upper end of this, even in the middle of this range, it will remake what the planet looks like. And so this is a huge amount of warming. And so let's talk about the damages from climate change. So what are the things that we know are going to happen? So we know temperatures are going to go up. They're already going up. We can measure it. We're going to get more extreme temperatures. We're going to get this. And this is going to cost us money because people have to adapt to warmer temperatures. So this is going to make us poorer. We see precipitation patterns changing. It's already happening. In particular, you get more rain in the heaviest events. We already see this happening. Think Hurricane Harvey. This is an extremely expensive and socially destabilizing climate change. Sea level is rising, something we already see happening and will certainly happen in the future. And again, that costs money to adjust to that. The ocean chemistry is changing. We call it ocean acidification. As the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, it changes the chemistry of the ocean. Now, these are things we already see happening. We understand why they're happening, and we are 100% certain they are going to continue to happen in the future. Now, we can argue about wildfire risk and things like that. I suspect that in the future, those things will all be tagged to climate change also. But let's ignore those and just talk about the things that we are 100% certain about. These things are enough, speaking now as a citizen, not as a scientist, but as a citizen, these things are all concerning to me, and I think they compel us to take action. And then there's a list of things that we're not sure about. Hurricanes, getting more intense and rainier, fires, droughts, floods. These are things I think are all likely, but we can't say they're 100% certain. And the reason that there's less certainty is we're not necessarily sure that we see changes in these things already the way we do in the category above. We already see temperatures going up, but hurricanes, we're not really sure we see a trend in hurricanes. The reason is that hurricanes are rare events. They just don't happen very often, so it's hard to get good statistics. But we have something that we call physics that tells us that hurricanes, for example, is a very simple argument about why they should get rainier. So if you believe in physics, then you have to really take that as something that's just probably going to happen. Maybe you're not 100% certain, but you have to be reasonably confident that you're going to see that. That also includes things like fires, droughts, floods. And these things all are going to cost us money. And every legitimate economist who's looked at climate change has concluded that climate change imposes net costs on society. Okay, so now we get to the true alarmist portion. So the true alarmist in the debate is Spencer. I mean, he is the alarmist. He's the one who says, if you try to switch to renewables, the economy will collapse. So the economy, in this view of the world, is magic. Climate warms, don't worry about it. The economy will adjust to that. Precipitation changes, don't worry about it. The economy will handle it. The free market will handle it. Oh, okay, let's put a carbon tax on. Oh no, the economy is going to collapse. It can't possibly handle slightly more expensive energy. This is the argument that you hear before every environmental regulation. So when we phased out fluorocarbons, they said, oh, it's going to bankrupt people. When we did the Clean Air Act, it's going to bankrupt people. I mean, the fact that people still listen to this argument and still believe it is really quite amazing to me. So these are the true alarmists in the debate. Spencer is an alarmist. He's trying to scare you. All right, so I don't think that there's anything else I want to say about this. This is just some more generic conspiracy theory crap. The end, but a place to begin discussion. So, it's pretty clear I don't think much of Spencer's argument. I think it's not, the science in it is not robust. A lot of the other things he said are his value judgments. He doesn't think it's a crisis. Fine. He's entitled to his opinion about it. But I object to the fact that he doesn't make it clear that it is his opinion. I will say right off the bat, my opinion is that it is something that we need to address. And, that's my opinion, having read all of the peer-reviewed literature. And so I hope this has been a useful critique, and I hope that you now understand what a mainstream scientist would say in response to Spencer's presentation.